Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Oilseed rape area has increased significantly over the past 2 years, primarily driven by high prices. The yields in 2022 were excellent, with most growers achieving close to 5 tonnes per hectare or 2 tonnes per acre. The weather during harvest in early September allowed planting to be completed in mostly good conditions. However, soils were very dry, which compromised the initial establishment of many crops. However, crops have grown strongly through September and October in response to the warm weather, but the wet weather in October and November is a worry for many growers, as this weather usually drives foliar disease. There hasn't been much chance so far to take any action in crops, as neither the weather nor the ground conditions have been suitable. The recent dry weather hopefully will change ground conditions, and there might be a chance to take some action over the coming week. Dr. Stephen Kildea, a researcher in Teagasc, joins me today to chat through the crop and if actions are needed. Stephen, you might give us an idea of what your opinion on crops are out there at the moment.
Yeah, I must say I've been in a few crops there in the last couple of days, and what I was in, we have some very good looking crops there at the moment, being honest. There has been some very good growth. They were put in great conditions, so they're flying it at the moment, which is a good thing.
Any idea then what sort of green area index, or GAI as you call it, or total biomass is out there in crops at the moment?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of biomass there. Any crops that went in very good conditions were able to hoover up any nutrients that were there. They had a good start. So look, one in Oak Park here it's probably above a GIA of 3. I suppose that's not all crops. There's some crops that are a little bit behind that, but in general, I think they're all looking fairly good.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing then in terms of disease control, or in terms of disease development rather than control? We'll get to control in a minute.
Yeah, in terms of disease development, look, what is good for the crop is good for the pathogen. Now, that said, look, the crops we're in, 2 crops in Oak Park. One, I suppose, actually, I should say, both crops have a high level of Phoma present, which I suppose, given the mild sort of September that we had, and temperatures in general being quite high and quite humid, isn't that big of a surprise. From the aspect then of having a good crop and a good canopy, it is a good thing from a Phoma perspective, because really Phoma is its stem canker is the problem that it causes. So the pathogen has lesions on the leaf that you can see, the black pycnidium, etc. But it actually has to grow down into the petiole. So that's where the issue arises. So if you have a small crop, small canopy, small leaves, it's a lot easier for it. It doesn't have as far to go. While if you've got a big leaf, big canopy, it has a little bit further to go, definitely. So it can be good from that aspect.
Maybe you might give us an idea of the other diseases that we might see in crops at the moment, and we might just come back then to specifics in terms of how we might control them.
Yeah, I suppose the other disease that I struggled to see in one crop in Oak Park, but I was able to find it quite readily in the second, is light leaf spot. And I suppose this is the one that probably would be of more concern from an Irish perspective, because it can get in, I suppose, and cause a lot of damage when those buds are emerging in early spring. So it is there. I suppose the case of the first crop, what I said, where I struggled to see it, it may be a case that it's there and I just wasn't able to visually see it in the field. Taking some samples in, putting them in a bag, hot boxing them maybe for 2 days, and you might be able to see the lesions and I suppose the spores, which look in the leaf like grains of salt. But in the second crop, while it wasn't every leaf or every plant that I looked at, it was easy enough to find it. So definitely was there.
So the difference then on the 2 different crops, because you mentioned earlier one crop was quite a big crop and the other crop was a smaller crop, but maybe on other years you'd be happy enough with it. Where were you struggling to see it, Stephen? Was it the bigger or the smaller crop?
It was actually the smaller crop, or sorry, it was the bigger crop. I was struggling to see it. I was finding it easier in the smaller crop. Now, what I would say is that because I was struggling to see it in that bigger crop, doesn't mean that it's not there. Look, this is the one disease that more than likely is there. It's just not at the level that we're able to see it readily in the field. It can be difficult enough to actually see, being honest. And especially when you've got those big leaves, it might be difficult to miss maybe small lesions. While on the smaller crop, there's smaller leaves. Yeah, there's less actually green to capture my eye, if you know what I mean. Okay. So I wouldn't be surprised if both crops had it.
And if you go back, maybe Stephen, you go back over the weather, it's been very wet basically for the last, 6 or 8 weeks now at this stage. Was the weather conducive to the spread? It certainly was a Phoma, because you said you've seen it there, but is it conducive to the spread of light leaf spot as well?
Oh, absolutely. Look, light leaf spot is a wet weather disease, full stop. I suppose the temperatures, you might say, maybe were a little bit high. We're in the late teens there for a while. I think light leaf spot tends to favor a little bit cooler. But definitely for the month of I suppose November, where we did actually temperatures came down a little bit, and it was very wet. Look, they were ideal conditions for light leaf spot, being honest.
Okay, so we would expect then that, given the fact that many varieties out there are reasonably resistant, does that make any difference in terms of the spread of that, or are they probably still in the zone of getting a significant infection?
Look, from an IPM perspective, resistance is a key source. Varietal resistance is a key source, and the more we have, the better. Now, that said, as this is a polycyclic sort of disease or pathogen, once it gets going in the crop, it will start to produce a lot of inoculum, which I suppose even in a resistant variety, come I suppose early spring, if the conditions are ripe over the next 2 months, or right over the next 2 months, we could easily have epidemics in quite resistant crops. So it is one that definitely I would be keeping an eye on.
So just going back for the uneducated lads like me, polycyclic, you mentioned, is that what you said? Polycyclic?
Yeah. So basically,
what are you talking about there? And back away from all that scientific stuff there. You're talking to lads like me on the ground.
No, I struggle with sometimes myself, Michael, being honest now. No, basically, it's able to complete its life cycle a number of times within the cropping season. So basically, every couple of weeks, it's probably producing new spores. So imagine now, if we have it in that crop where I says, look, we can readily see it, it means that spores, they've been produced, they're being splashed. If there's any bit of rain over the next month or next couple of weeks, they'll be splashed around and they'll start a new cycle themselves. And within a couple of weeks, they'll be producing spores, which will be splashed around again and producing more infection. So basically, it's able to complete a number of these cycles within a season. And really, what's important is that if the conditions in terms of its development and spread, so as I say, that slightly cooler, but also again, look, we need rain to splash these spores around. If they sort of if those conditions continue for the next 2 months, as the buds are emerging, there'll be quite a lot of inoculum there. I'd say even in some of those more resistant varieties, if the conditions, as we have had over the last, I suppose, couple of weeks, have started that sort of process by providing the conditions to allow that first infection to occur, 3 or 4 more cycles of those, by the time it comes to early spring, middle of February, there'll be plenty of inoculum about.
So just to put it in context, then, you mentioned there's lots of Phoma there as well, and there's potentially a load of light leaf spot. If that went and conditions were conducive to that kind of spread, and it kind of got into the plants, and it kind of done and it tried to do as much damage as it could, what sort of yield decreases would you be looking at in an uncontrolled scenario?
Oh, in an uncontrolled scenario, look, I suppose the light leaf spot is the one. If it takes out the terminal raceme, it can take out a quite a significant chunk of yield, 20% of yield potentially in terms of that. The Phoma, from an Irish perspective, I'll be honest, I haven't seen a huge amount of impact from a Phoma in terms of stem canker. But the potential there is actually, look, you could get crops lodging, early senescence, if there is canker there, and you get a high level of that. And that's where its impact is. The light leaf spot, as I say, gets onto the buds, can damage the buds, abort them, pod sort of sites and things like that. And it'll continue potentially even get on the stems, get on the pods as they're developing. So it can cause quite a bit of damage. The Phoma,
Okay.
It is all dependent on it getting in and causing that canker. And then, of course, early senescence lodging.
Okay. So then, in terms of control, you mentioned about green bud stage. Is it, do we, or does a farmer kind of think, well, sure, I'll try and get in before that, maybe a week or two before that green bud stage, and would that be good enough? Or is there a scenario where we need to go in now and come back in again? What's the thinking?
Yeah, so look, what I would say, if you have light leaf spot, you have Phoma that you're going to have to treat. I suppose that Phoma might be the one. If you have to treat, if you've got a high level of Phoma there in the field, you're going to have to treat. The chemistry that we'll be using there would probably be sort of controlling light leaf spot also. But in specifically the light leaf spot at the bud stage, if you're sort of saying, okay, maybe I'll go that little bit earlier and I'll stop the disease there, if we've allowed the disease to develop over the winter months, and of course this is going to be dependent on I suppose the variety to start with that gives that sort of a base sort of level of resistance, and then the conditions that are from now through to that sort of bud stage, there may well be sufficient amount of inoculum in that crop that even going that bit early, you're not actually going to be able to stop that disease because it'll get onto the early buds. So really what you're looking for in that will be to protect those early buds. Now, the aspect of going now is going to be a case of actually almost bringing that cycle back, or that epidemic, delaying it a little bit so that actually it doesn't peak at the bud stage. But again, that is to some extent all going to depend on the weather conditions that we do have. Now, as I say, if you are controlling Phoma, the chemistry that we're going to be using, look, we're relying a lot on prothioconazole, and we'll also be controlling the light leaf spot. But if you have high levels of light leaf spot in the crop, and you'd be talking more than 10% of crops sort of infected, plants infected, then there's quite a level of inoculum there, and it may need to be knocked back a bit because, as I say, the conditions over the next few months, it'll only build up more and more inoculum.
Okay, so you mentioned prothioconazole or proline, as most other people might actually know it. So from that point of view, will that do the trick in terms of light leaf spot and Phoma in the one pass, or do we need something else?
No, it will, being honest. It will. Now, what I would say is, look, we've had a PhD student here who's just completed her PhD, Deanna Bakur, on light leaf spot, and she's done an awful lot of work on the sensitivity of the azoles. And look, and there is some indication that there are shifts in the population in terms of sensitivity occurring. Now, they're not as dramatic as they would be in Septoria, but it is an indication that we do need to be aware of managing these chemistries. Definitely probably a bigger shift to tebuconazole, and we know that from a light leaf spot perspective, it's not quite as good as prothio. But we do have to be aware that, look, the more we use them, the more that we will push that population. So that comes back to sort of the aspect in terms of, look, if you have no Phoma, it's very clean, there's no light leaf spot in the field at the moment, it would be questioning whether you need to go out with that application for light leaf spot at this stage. However, if you do have Phoma, it will have to be managed. And if there is light leaf spot in the crop, it should be managed also at this stage. So it is going to be an aspect of, look, get into the crop, see what's there.
So you mentioned a 10% infection level for the light leaf spot. And in Phoma, is it something similar in terms of a threshold?
It is, but again, it comes back down to the canopy too, because it comes back to that conversation that we had just a few minutes ago, that if you've got a bigger leaf, it's going to be harder for that disease to actually get down into the petiole. And imagine now that as the temperatures get colder, not only does the plant sort of slow down in its growth, but also the pathogen will be slowing down its growth. So you would have a higher sort of a level, you'd be looking for more infection on those bigger crops than if you had a very small crop, then yeah, it would be more at risk.
Okay. So in terms of rates, do you have any recommendations on that in terms of the standard prothio rate would probably be 0.8 of a litre per hectare, is that?
I think it would be, it would be lower in oilseed rape. You would be going lower. And again, it comes back to actually, look, what are we trying to achieve? We're just trying to, from a Phoma perspective, we're stopping it where it is at the moment. And its progression as the temperature will cool down will be slower. So you'd be sort of banking on that to a certain extent to help in terms of the progression there. And again, canopy size will have come into this and the level of infection that will be there. From the light leaf spot perspective, you're trying to basically slow it down from developing pretty much. So I don't think you'd necessarily need to be going with the full rate. And again, look, the aspect of resistance management would be saying, look, you can tailor back that rate a bit. And
we know, I suppose, we have very big canopies out there, and maybe in other years there'll be an awful lot of talk about growth regulation. What's your thinking about that? I suppose, given the fact that weather is now going to cool down quite a lot and growth will reduce quite a bit, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, so when you're talking about the growth regulation, look, when we've been talking about prothio, we're really talking about whether other azoles such as metcon or tebuconazole are actually a specific growth regulator itself. I suppose I'd like to be looking at the weather and sort of saying, look, if it's going to be cooling down, that's going to slow down growth dramatically. And I'd be asking then the question, does that crop need growth regulator? The other thing is, look, we want it to hoover up as much N, and we don't necessarily, even if it is growing, we don't want to be slowing it down even further, because look, nitrogen, the price it is and things like that, we don't want to be losing a huge amount of that. We want to capture as much as possible.
Is there still a chance, Stephen, to go back at the growth regulation if needed in the springtime?
Oh yes, of course there is. Yeah, absolutely. Like there'll be, I suppose, ample opportunity before. Well, you'd hope there'll be ample opportunity. Of course, it's going to depend on the weather conditions, whether we can get into fields or not. But there should be before it would really kick into gear.
Okay, so somewhere in kind of late February, early March kind of thing. Just there should be a bit of time to get back in.
There should be. Yeah,
might control a bit with some of those. Okay. So that should cover off most of that. I suppose, look, the other side of it is probably a little bit of, I know it's not necessarily your area, but in terms of some of the weed control, any idea whether the fungicides are relatively compatible with the weed control options out there at the moment?
Yeah, as far as I know, there shouldn't be any major issues, being honest. With the fungicides, if you are getting into a field to put out a herbicide, whether you can or not is a different sort of question. But I don't think there'd be any issues with putting the fungicides in. Shouldn't be.
Okay, Stephen, look, that's brilliant. I think that gives people a fairly decent idea. Get out in the field, as we normally say in this podcast. You don't know anything until you walk. Get out, have a look for the light leaf spot. If you see it fairly readily, we're probably saying go and put an application on. If you can't see it, we're saying collect up 10 or 20 leaves from around the field, stick it into a bag, stick that into a nice warm place. Have a look at that over the after about 2 days. If you see that kind of salting type kind of white lesions kind of thing on it, you probably have a decent level of light leaf spot there. If you don't, and there's no great need to spray. Would that kind of sum it up a bit?
I think that'd be pretty much it, Michael, being honest. Look, even with myself, when I'm looking at it, once you see one, generally you'll see another leaf that will have it. That's the way. If it's in the field, it tends to be a case that it becomes everything, if you know what I mean. It's quite rapid, that aspect of it.
Okay. You're training your eye to see what you're looking at, I suppose, as often as you want to.
Exactly.
But you can't do that if you're sitting in a car passing by at 30 miles an hour.
No, you most definitely can't.
Stephen, that's brilliant. Thanks very much. We'll have you back again, maybe to chat about this again, to kind of see where crops are going at that stage.
No problem, Mike.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Stephen for joining me on the podcast. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.